So today I want to chat a little bit about what it takes to reach a FIDE rating of roughly 2000, and I want to keep this clear and concise. I don't want to yap on for too long, but basically why 2000 FIDE? And the reason is for people who play tournaments at some point or another, this ends up being the rating that they care about most. And some of you might not yet play tournaments, but you might be interested in doing so at some point, and this might be a goal that you have in mind. For many players, it is something that they one day want to achieve. When I started chess a bit late. I started playing in tournaments when I was like 12 or 13, close to that age. I couldn't really even imagine reaching that rating. I thought it was like you had to be a genius or something. Didn't take too long for me to realize that just was not true. So maybe for some of you who are not yet at that strength, this video will have some insight for you. So yeah, basically how strong really is 2000 FIDE? And in this video, I'm not going to be giving some like step-by-step training plan or something that you can execute on to reach this rating, because truth be told, it's going to look different for everyone how they get there, and not everyone should necessarily be doing the exact same thing. Some people need to work on different things. Some people have different strengths that they should be playing to, and it just wouldn't really make sense to give some cookie cutter solution because it's going to be different for everyone at the end of the day. But I do think it helps to really have some kind of fundamental understanding of, like, you know, let's say the traits of someone who is 2000 FIDE, so you kind of at least know what general direction you're aiming for, if that makes sense. And first of all, so 2000 FIDE, it's not like you're some Albert Einstein to be this rating. You don't need to have like some superhuman talent for the game to reach this level. You're probably going to need to put in a bit of work. So if you're really lazy and you just want to sit on the couch and do nothing and somehow reach this strength, it's probably not going to happen for most of you unless you are some sort of really talented player. But for those who don't mind and they even like working on chess, this should be good news. I also want to say that, like, if you are this level, it's a sort of level where at your local chess club, you're somebody. You're one of the top players there usually, but in the big scheme of things, you're still kind of no one special. But it's like the sort of player who, if you live in, let's say, like your average big city, like growing up, for me this was Melbourne in Australia. I remember like when I got to 2000 FIDE for the first time, I all of a sudden was starting to be like one of the maybe top 5 or 10 players in any given tournament that I would play. Not always, but like the average weekend tournament, that would sort of be where I roughly stood. There were usually like a few players who were stronger than me, but by that point, I was like one of the better players at my club, but I was still no one special. And the reason I point this out is because, like, for most people, if they like go to a local chess club, and now if you live in some super small town, it might not be like this, but you will actually like have players like who you at least somewhat know who are that strength. Whereas like 2600 GM, a lot of people are never even going to come into contact with someone at that level. And when you meet these people, you'll realize that they're actually, and some people will just be thinking like, what's this guy talking about? I know plenty of people who are 2000 and they're all idiots. And good for you. But basically what I want to say is most people who are 2000 are just normal people who put in some work to chess, and they're kind of decent. But at the same time, nothing crazy. Another thing I want to touch on, location kind of matters when it comes to FIDE rating. Like there's a whole meme about like the Indian kid who like goes to Europe and then gains like 400 rating points in a month or something. And it's like, yeah, was that kid really like 1800? I mean, probably not, right? It's probably just that he lived in India and that deflated his rating. So the country you're in is going to some extent distort you know, the rating that you are at, right? And so like if you're, for example, like 1800 but you live in like Southeast Asia, you might not technically be 2000 FIDE, but there's a good chance that actually if you went to another country, you would actually be that strength. And this is where maybe using online ratings can be a good approximation for like how close you are to this level. It's not perfect. Some people are better at like faster time controls, which is predominantly what online chess is. And from what I've seen, at least, I think 22 to 2300 on either chess.com or Lichess and like Blitz or whatnot tends to be roughly what 2000 FIDE is. Again, that can differ from person to person. That's not always going to be correct, but it's a rough ballpark, I think, for what approximates that level of player. And for understanding the traits of what actually constitutes a 2000 rated player, it's actually kind of a bit maybe underwhelming, or at least for some of you might find it that way. And again, this is sort of like my opinion to some extent, but it's also based off of my experience of being a player of this rating, seeing many other players who are at this level, talking to many other players as well and their opinions on things. And basically I've come to the conclusion that most people who are 2000 FIDE, they're usually only good at maybe 1 or 2 things. And some people might find this sort of maybe condescending, but I don't mean it to come off that way at all. Like when I was at that level, I can really say that the things that made me that level were mainly my positional understanding, and also I was actually quite creative as a player in many of the maybe tactical ideas I was able to come up with. Apart from that, there were a lot of real like problems in my play. I had a lot of weaknesses as a player, but those things really carried me very far. And I want to say that because you don't need to be like, there's this idea a lot of people throw around, like you need to work on your weaknesses and you need to be like a well-rounded player, but that comes in at a point. But for most players to get to 2000, they can kind of work a lot on the things that naturally are their strengths. Like to some extent, you can't know like absolutely nothing about positional chess and be 2000. There might be a person or two out there that exists like that. You are going to need to know some fundamentals, so to speak, but you don't need to be like amazing at endgames, amazing at positional chess, good at calculation, or even like kind of quote unquote decent at all of them. Inevitably, if you're at that rating, you're probably going to like, you know, suck at 1 or 2 of those things. I can tell you when I was 2000, I was, again, like positional chess and whatnot, that was sort of my wheelhouse, but I sucked at calculation. When I got into positions I was unfamiliar with, I tended to kind of go astray quite quickly. I think that's true for a lot of players. I also was not very good in handling a lot of positions where I would say things are kind of dynamic. And this sort of ties into my next point, how there's sort of the spectrum of static chess and then dynamic chess. And the static chess is a lot of the things, well, you might be able to imply sort of what it means by just the word static, but it's like these things which kind of are not so malleable in the position, like, you know, material count, pawn structure, those are 2 big ones, whereas dynamic chess is stuff like, you know, instead of material and the pawn structure, it's like sometimes you give up material to attack, or you take on a bad pawn structure to get an initiative against your opponent's uncastled king or something. Very often people who are at 2000, they're not really good at both of these things. They usually are only good at like one or the other, and it usually takes at least until about 2200 to sort of get a decent handle on the other, but usually still at that level you're going to have like still one that you're a little bit better at than the other. For me, when I got to 2200 FIDE for the first time, my rating dropped a little bit below that after I took a bit of a break from chess. But one of the big differences between me when I got to 2200 and me when I was 2000 was just simply that I had taken time to learn about some dynamic areas of chess. For a long time, I was terrified of the idea of giving up any material. I'm going to show a quick game at the end to sort of illustrate sort of how that sort of manifested in my actual gameplay. But like once you reach 2000, and there's no like clear hard point for this, some people might disagree with me even, but in my opinion, this is usually where you really need to start buckling down, and you can't just really rely on the things you're naturally good at. You're going to have to start working on things a lot more that are going to feel a bit painful to you, and to be honest, you don't really want to do. For a long time for me, I was really lazy. I didn't really want to work on calculation because I thought that was hard work, but I realized at some point, looking at my tournament games that were causing me a lot of suffering, losses I had were painful, I realized that my calculation, just to be honest, sucked. And if I wanted to be any better at this game, especially in tournament chess, I would have to work on this area of my game. In blitz chess, like calculation doesn't matter as much because there's so little time, right? But in tournament chess, where you have like 90 minutes on the clock to start with, you know, if someone just calculates better than you, that's happening game after game, that's a bit of a problem. But anyways, that being said, I want to show 2 examples from my games from the period of 2017 when I had first reached this sort of rating of around 2000 FIDE, and sort of show like the good side of what I was able to produce, but also on the flip side, like how bad some of my games could get. Alright, so this is a position that I had in one of my worst tournaments ever, actually. I probably won't go into full detail in this video of what happened, but basically this tournament was like, it was some club championship, basically 1 game a week sort of deal. And I remember I actually won the first game against the top seed in the tournament, and then I lost my next 7, and then I finally drew the last game. But it was an absolute nightmare of a tournament. I almost wanted to quit chess during it. But yeah, this was one of the games I had in the tournament. At the time, my rating was 2080. It dropped a lot after this tournament, to say the least, and my opponent was an older guy, actually a former Australian champion, I believe, Douglas Hamilton. He was rated about 2100. At the time, his peak was 23, somewhere in the 2300s, basically. And we reached this position. It was really a wacky Benoni. The Benoni was an opening that I struggled a lot with, because as to what I was saying earlier, the Benoni is sort of a more dynamic opening, and for me, statics was something that I was pretty good with, static chess, but when it got really messy and things started to get tactical, and to me wasn't like some clear-cut sort of way to play the position, that's where I really tend to struggle a lot. So he just played f5 in this position, and the last few moves I had this kind of possibility to maybe play bishop takes h5, giving him doubled h-pawns, but I sort of recognized even if I did do this, he got the open g-file maybe he could use later on, and that his king actually wasn't that weak, because he had a lot of pieces sort of that were ready to come into the action, which would probably outnumber any sort of attackers that I could put around his king. So it wouldn't really have done all that much good for me to really take on h5, not to mention if I actually take it at this point, he has knight c4, and he's at least going to get my dark squared bishop, which is one of my best pieces on the board. So in this position, I end up taking on f5, and I was kind of anticipating this point, well, if he takes this, he's just going to hang a piece queen, and if he takes the rook, I was starting to really salivate at the idea of going g4, and I'm like, wow, I'm like a genius because I'm forking these pieces, I'm going to win material, I'm going to beat like a former Australian champion, I'm such a genius. But this is where things started to go downhill for me. Basically, in this position, I had to suffer one of my many defeats from basically a severe lack of appreciation for the attacking opportunities that my opponent had in the position. And as you can see, every single one of my opponent's pieces is actually in decent proximity to my king side. And meanwhile, I have quite a few pieces that are kind of a bit far away from the action. Most of them are somewhat in proximity to it, but there's a good chance that if things do open up on the king side, that I am actually going to be outnumbered, and that's kind of exactly what happened here. And that is a bit like conceptual, and at the end of the day, things are very concrete. If it works, it works. But I very much lacked a sense of danger, and just was overly obsessed at this point in time with trying to basically win as much material as possible, or stuff like pawn structure. These very, like, again, static elements of chess, I didn't very much appreciating of these dynamic things. So I went ahead and played g4, and this is the beginning of the end. It turns out I should have just played something like rook a d1 and bring a piece in. It's still not completely clear, but maybe at some point I kick the knight away with f4. I have to be careful with like immediately doing f4. For example, there could be knight c4 in this position, takes and takes, and if I take back, then I just lose my queen. And if I don't take back, well, this is a very dangerous position. Opposite colored bishops, but if you know something about middle game positions and opposite colored bishops, it usually favors the attacking side, because if you think about it, like if this bishop was on the dark square, it'd be able to defend on the dark squares against their bishop coming into the attack. But because it's on the light square, and we're not really using it to attack, it's basically almost like a dead piece, you can kind of think of it. Again, a bit of an exaggeration, but this position should be avoided. So I was kind of thinking, getting all excited about g4, but then he played knight f3 check, and I took it, of course, because otherwise I would have lost my queen. He took back, and then I realized, like, oh, like, yeah, if I take his knight, he's probably going to play like queen h4, and he's probably going to start bringing like the queen in, or maybe take the rook, or go for something like this, and it's very difficult, kind of impossible for me to defend against that. So I was like, okay, I think I know what to do. I'm gonna play like king g2, and if he plays, well, something like queen h4, maybe I can then take the rook, so that would force him to move back, then I can take the knight, and basically I was just dreaming in like Disneyland or something, he just took on e3, and then I was like, whoa, yeah, I didn't see that move. And basically, if I take this, he's going to play queen g5 and mate my king. And if I take this, then what he did was he gave a check. And if I go this way, there's queen h4. So I was like, I'll go the other way, queen h4 anyway. And yeah, basically after this, I resigned because either I'm getting mated in one, or I go this way and I lose my queen. And neither of those I particularly liked, so I just resigned at this point. And yeah, it just taught me like a very important lesson this game, to really be very careful about, you know, opening up your king like this and not underestimating the power of like just the initiative and your opponent just having pieces that can really come into the attack. Even if you can't fully calculate like how their attack is going to work from the start, it's important to have this instinct at least that like, oh, maybe things could go wrong here. For me, that was completely undeveloped at the time. The only thing I had instincts for was like, oh, good pawn structure, or I'm up a piece. Like, it was like, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but like as you saw from this game, it was pretty bad. And it's not like this was, by the way, his only win that I missed. It wasn't like I just missed one move. There were many other things he could have done that were also pretty good. Like, it was just fundamentally wrong. It wasn't like I just miscalculated one line. It was like the whole concept of going for g4 was just wrong. On the other hand, I also got positions like these sometimes, and this is the sort of type of position which, when I got, like, I would do pretty well in. And the guy I was playing, this is when this time in my life, I actually moved to Japan. My family moved there, and I was playing against this guy, Gentaro, who basically, from my understanding at least, he used to be some sort of Japan champion in chess, and I think at his peak he might have been 2200. Not completely sure. At the time of this game, I think he might have been 2000 still. And it was funny because when I went there, I again had a FIDE rating. It dropped a little bit below 2000 at this point because I had a couple bad tournaments. But for some reason, when I lived there at the time, they gave me like a really low rating to start off with. So at this tournament, I had like a national rating of like 1300 or something. And like the guy must have thought I was like some complete patzer when I was playing him. But here I am, and I have a pretty good position where, yeah, basically the point is we have a sort of King's Indian structure, but the king side's completely locked up. So he's not going to get in the f5 break. And meanwhile, I, as white, have the kind of advantage in the sense that I still have a pawn break available on the queen side, which is naturally where I want to play anyway. So I can execute my plan on the queen side, black can't execute their plan on the king side, and I was able to do a pretty good job at just executing this. I was able to bring all the pieces in. I'm a little bit patient. I don't go for b4 immediately. I go knight d1 first, just sort of rearranging my pieces. Can't remember exactly what I was thinking. This was played like 7 years ago again, but okay, at this point I go to c5, and the idea was after d takes c5 not to go rook takes c5 immediately, because then bishop e7 I thought I'd kind of be hanging the a3 pawn. So my plan was to go bishop e3 and then take the pawn, which I did. And still, like, this sort of position might not look completely easy to crack through, but this was the sort of thing that I was actually pretty decent at, which was that even when, like, you know, the position might have seemed kind of difficult to convert, I was actually pretty good at pulling through and winning these sort of games. So I end up kind of maneuvering around a little bit, bring my knight to d3, where it can sort of reinforce the bishop on c5. If they ever take it, well, then I'm going to get a monster knight on c5, pressure the e5 pawn, they defend it. I just double up my rooks now, and after some rearranging the pieces, bring the bishop back to c5. I don't remember completely what I was doing. I'm sure I could explain this, but I don't want to like make the whole video about just this particular game. I just want to show like kind of again the general sort of way in which like I was good at winning games, but again the flip side, like the previous game, that was also like depths of how low I could fall. But okay, at this point rearrange the pieces a bit more. I decided to bring the knight to maybe f5 now. On d3 it didn't feel so useful anymore. He ends up taking it. At some point he brings the queen to e8, I bring the king to g4, brings the queen to d7. He didn't want to take because at this point that would sort of trap the rook. But even this is not super simple because this is almost a fortress. If you want to try pause the video, figure out how to break through, I suggest you do so. But that being said, what you can do is you can actually just sacrifice the exchange back on d6, bring the rook in, and now essentially you're going to come around and win this guy, and then you're going to rush the h-pawn up the board. So queen d7 is what he played instead, and not taking the queen on c6. He probably thought he'd been losing an exchange. It's a little bit more complicated. But after all this, I finally bring my queen in, and I'm breaking through now, because if this rook moves, he's going to hang this, so he sacrifices the exchange. But now, okay, he doesn't have a fortress, because I can just sack my exchange back and, more importantly, win his queen. So this was a game at the time I was pretty proud of. I felt that it was probably one of like my best positional games I ever played at the time. Now I've definitely played some games which I think are better, but you know, when you're 2000, you can play some pretty good games like this, but you can again also play some pretty bad ones, like the one I played in this game where I went for g4 and I just completely did not understand kind of or feel what was demanded by the position at all. But yeah, anyways, that's going to be a good spot to end off this video. If you want to work with me more one-on-one, I do have a coaching form down in the description below that you can fill out. I also have a free newsletter that there will be a link to in the description below. I send breakdowns on topics like these. Last week I actually sent them my breakdown on what it takes to reach 2000, the topic in this video. So yeah, I highly recommend signing up to that if you are interested in these sorts of topics. Sometimes they come out before I put them on YouTube. So yeah, otherwise, please, if you like the video, like and subscribe. But yeah, that's going to be it for the video. Hope you guys have a good day.